Good evening, friends at WeAct. This is Emily Craig, and our show is Getting Along Together, and tonight's episode is We Are What We Owe, and what we owe generally are social obligations to higher powers and to leadership, okay? And so tonight I'm going to talk about the history of the treaties and arrangements and covenants and agreements that most of us here in Western society have bought into and agreed to. And I'm going to show that a lot of us really don't understand the obligations, terms, and conditions of what we have agreed to. And the reason I'm bringing this to you is because I'm new to Israel. I grew up in a Bolshevik Russian family who had a lot of ties to Israel, but I just found out in the last 10 years that I'm not the Gentile I thought I was and that I was brought up to be. I'm just finding out that, yes, both my parents were part of the bloodline. All right, and so the first thing I had to do was make a copy of the law, of the Jewish law. And I figure that people who are Jewish are interested in what's in the Jewish law. Certainly I have been. So link number one is my copy of the Jewish law, and I took the 613 mitzvot and I put them in a text file, and as an editor I organized them and categorized them and made sense of them and prioritized them so we can talk about the behavioral characteristics of the covenant of God that we accepted and bought into. And the first aspect of that was that of consent. The law is something that Jewish people consent to. And in Exodus 19:8 it says, when Moses set before them all that the Lord had ordered him to tell them, the people all answered together, everything the Lord has said we will do. Then Moses brought back to the Lord the response of the people. Cool. All right. So there's a lot in the law about tithes and taxes and supporting the kingdom arrangement, okay? And I'll read through some of them. You'll see just how specifically behavioral the law is, and it has nothing to do with attitude. It has nothing to do with beliefs. It has nothing to do with wishes. It's just very cut and dried. Exodus 22:28. The order of separating the truma and tithes shall be the order first fruits at the beginning, and then the truma, then the first tithe, and the last the second tithe. Okay. Exodus 30:13. Each household shall give the value of half a shekel every year to the tabernacle for provision of the public sacrifices. Okay. There. All right. Deuteronomy 18:3 and 4. Give the Kohen a shoulder, the tongue, and half the ribs of the clean beasts to roast and feed his extended family on that day. Give the first of the fleece to the Kohen. Set apart Truma Godola, the great heave offering, that is a small portion of the grain, wine, and oil for the Kohen. So this was an agrarian society that most of them were farmers and ranchers, which I understand is a lot of the way of Israel today, that it's very, very communal. Deuteronomy 26:14. Expend the proceeds of the second tithe for food and drink for everyone in the community. Distribute it all without holding back. Eat the second tithe in a state of cleanliness, or if not, redeem oneself. Postpone eating the second tithe in case of mourning. That's okay. Deuteronomy 26:13. Make a declaration of the accurate weight of one's gift when bringing the second tithe to the tabernacle. Do not use two sets of measures, one for business and the other for the tithe. All right. So how did they treat outsiders in those days? They said, do not cheat nor allow cheating. Leviticus 19:13. Do not rob by violence or grab and retain what is not yours to have. Do not rob by lies, trickery, deception, or fraud. Leviticus 19:13 and Deuteronomy 26:13. Ensure that scales and weights are correct and accurate. Leviticus 19:34, Deuteronomy 15:3, 23:21, 25:13, 26:13. Do not do anyone wrong in buying or selling. Use standard measures, not two sets of measures, one for the brother and one for the foreigner. This is despicable. Okay, Exodus 22:20-24. Treat the stranger fairly. Exact financial transactions among outsiders, but do not take part in any usurious over conventional prime rate transactions, neither as a surety, nor as a witness, nor as a writer of the bond for anyone. Lend to an outsider at favorable, not usury rates, so your name will not be accursed. Treat the alien who resides among you no different in all ways, for you were once aliens. Okay. Deuteronomy 7:3. Do not marry nor allow your children to marry unknown, untested characters. Well, this is wise. Okay. Leviticus 25:46. Keep an outsider in community as long as he remains lawful. Ban and exile those who violate the law. Do not, and that's this law. Okay. Do not exclude other ethical peoples or races from the community after they have resided in peace for 3 generations. Deuteronomy 23:8 and 9. You know, this says a lot about the current situation with immigrants, too, doesn't it? Okay. Okay. Exodus 20:13. Do not slay anyone, nor cause wrongful death, nor kidnap anyone, taking them where they do not want to go. Deal with a beautiful woman in distress or war with respect. Do not sell her nor degrade her to the condition of a bondwoman. Deuteronomy 21:10-14, or worse, as the nations do. All right? And so it's all about treating people honestly and fairly. And so that is my interpretation of what Judaism is about, is treating people honestly and fairly. Now understand, I grew up as a Gentile in a Jewish cultural home, and they thought, that's what they thought I was. And so what they did for me was put me to work, whereas my cousins who were more favored got vacations and shopping trips and so on. But as things turn out, I feel like I was the lucky one, because I learned the value of $1 and I don't need 50 pairs of shoes in the bottom of my closet. All right, so we look at how Judaism moved in the world. And last week I referred to a book, The Tribes, the movement of the Israeli tribes after the diaspora. All right. And I also talked about the Stone of Scone covenant of the patriarch Jacob, and how that covenant, that stone, had arrived in Terracourt County, Ireland in 583 BC, according to the Hebrew calendar, with the prophet Jeremiah and King Zephaniah's 2 daughters, Teotephi and Sophia. Okay, so that the theocratic monarchy that began with King David, a part of it and a branch of it went north with the tribal migration into Ireland and formed a line of kings up there, okay, after the temple was taken down. All right. Then later, link number 2 is the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was a treaty that the barons of Britain insisted that King John sign because he was so unreasonable and he was not keeping to the Celtic laws that derived from that British branch of the Davidic monarchy. Okay, feudalism was the framework by which all landowning was governed in England during medieval times. It essentially granted the king control of all the land in his kingdom, which was worked by peasants and overseen by feudal barons. Everyone in the hierarchy had financial and social responsibilities to the rank above them, including the barons who reported directly to the king. Tucked inconspicuously near the middle of the Magna Carta is what historians consider one of the document's most enduring legacies. Habeas corpus, or the right to due process and a trial by jury, is a universal legal concept today, we hope, but didn't exist in the law books until the barons noted in the Magna Carta that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. Okay. So, still of great significance today, also the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution reads almost identically to that statute written 575 years earlier. Okay, the next link number 3. The papal bull annulling the Magna Carta, all right? Full title, Bulla Innocentii Papae III, okay. It's you found in the public domain in most countries other than the UK. It's held by British Library Shelfmark. The papal bull annulling the Magna Carta was issued by Pope Innocent on 24th of August 1215. It was written by a scribe in the papal chancery and is authenticated by the leaden Bulla seal of the Pope. Innocent had already sent a string of letters to England berating the barons. Now he explained how, by such violence and fear as might affect the most courageous of men, they had forced King John to accept an agreement illegal, unjust, harmful to royal rights, and shameful to the English people. The Pope declared Magna Carta null and void of all validity forever, a judgment which reached England the following month. And to add that, in that papal bull, Pope Innocent claimed that he owned all of the souls on this world, so that when, in 1588, Queen Elizabeth's British Navy defeated the Spanish Armada and annulled that papal bull, she claimed that she now owned all the souls belonging to the British Empire, all right, and that they were subject to her under maritime admiralty laws of the sea. And that's how maritime admiralty laws began the process of overturning and replacing the common laws of the land. Okay, so now we'll move on from 1558 to 1776, when people being disgusted with the rulings of monarchy, many came. Oh, the Treaty of Verona. Okay, the Treaty of Verona is 1822, all right. But the arbitrary acts and rulings of the monarchies and the Inquisition and the Crusades and all of that sent people to the North American continent, where in 1776, the Declaration of Independence and a Constitution with 10 amendments guaranteed civil rights. It was assembled in Washington, D.C. the same year that Weishaupt organized the Illuminati to dissemble constitutional governments. And at this point, link 4 is the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which is the playbook that the Illuminati have utilized to disassemble governments by consent since the Constitution of the United States. Link number 5 is the Secret Treaty of Verona. And the Secret Treaty of Verona was actually penned in 1822 as a reaction to the Declaration of Independence and the movement of ordinary working people to have a say in their own local governance. Okay. So the Secret Treaty of Verona was quoted at length in the U.S. Congress in 1822, and it is so insidious. I want to quote quite a bit of it so you get some idea of how the elite cadres, the effete Illuminati and the Vatican and the Masonic orders had started proliferating in about the same time as Weishaupt, how they began planning for a takedown of consensual governments to be replaced by yet another empire. I wish to put in the record the Secret Treaty of Verona of November 22nd, 1822, showing what this ancient conflict is between the rule of law and the rule of the many. I wish to call attention of the Senate to this treaty because it is the threat of this treaty which was the basis of Monroe Doctrine. It throws a powerful white light upon the conflict between monarchical government and government by the people. The Holy Alliance, under the influence of Metternich, the premier of Austria, in 1822, issued this remarkable document. The undersigned specially authorized to make some additions to the Treaty of the Alliance, after having exchanged their respective credentials, have agreed as follows. And this is what the rich of those days, which was 200 years ago, believed was correct. Article 1. The high contracting powers, being convinced that the system of representative government is equally as incompatible with the monarchical principles as the maximum of sovereignty of the people with the high divine right, engage mutually in the most solemn manner to use all their efforts to put an end to the system of representative governments in whatever country it may exist in Europe, and to prevent its being introduced in those countries where it is not yet known. How's that? Article 2. As it cannot be doubted that the liberty of the press is the most powerful means used by the pretended supporters of the rights of nations to the detriment of princes, the high contracting parties promise reciprocally to adopt all proper measures to suppress the press, not only in their own states, but also in the rest of Europe. Is this sounding familiar? Article 3. Convinced that the principles of religion contribute most powerfully to keep nations in the state of passive obedience which they owe to their princes, the high contracting parties declare it to be their intention to sustain in their respective states those measures which the clergy may adopt with the aim of ameliorating their own interests, so intimately connected with the preservation of the authority of the princes. And the contracting powers join in offering their thanks to the Pope for what he has already done for them, and solicit his constant cooperation in their views of submitting the nations. Whoops. Article 5. In order to establish in the peninsula the order of things which existed before the Revolution of Cadiz, and to ensure the entire execution of the articles of the present treaty, the high contracting parties give to each other the reciprocal assurance that as long as their views are not fulfilled, rejecting all other ideas of utility or other measures to be taken, they will address themselves with the shortest possible delay to all the authorities existing in their states and to all their agents in foreign countries with the view to establish connections tending toward the accomplishment of the objects proposed by this treaty. Article 6. This treaty shall be renewed with such changes as new circumstances may give occasion for, either at a new Congress or at the court of one of the contracting parties, as soon as the war with Spain shall be terminated. Okay. Article 7. The present treaty shall be ratified and the ratifications exchanged at Paris within the space of 6 months, made at Verona the 22nd of November, 1822. Now, really, I mean, is any legislature going to take this kind of treaty seriously? Well, indeed. We see in Link 6, in 1830 to 1834, the Indian Removal Act accomplished the same objective in the United States that the Verona Treaty sought in Europe, and that was to subdue and subjugate people not under a rule of law, but by top-down fiat. The Indian Removal Act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830. Authorizing the president to grant unsettled lands west of the Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands within existing state borders. A few tribes went peacefully, but many resisted the relocation policy. During the fall and winter of 1838 and 1839, the Cherokees were forcibly moved west by the United States government. Approximately 4,000 Cherokees died on this forced march, which became known as the Trail of Tears. Okay. And then just a few years later, after the establishment of the new Zion in Salt Lake City by the new Jewish church called the Mormon Church, just a few years later after he was murdered, Tartaria, the Ottoman Empire, folded up in a mud flood in 1847 apocalypse. And the outcome was that a new Zion had to be proclaimed out of the law and scriptures. One in 1830 by Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, but another by Illuminati and Schofield Bible speculators who believed that Israel and Palestine was where Zionism had to be returned. Scripturally, Zion can be anywhere that God's people are wholly law-abiding and where they build their temples for temple service. But Khazarian Zionists were insistent. They wanted things their way, and the Rothschild family were from Khazaria. Link number 7. The Balfour Declaration. During the reign of Queen Victoria, her grandson, Georgie, Duke of York, was her favorite, and he sat at her knee and listened to her hopes for the solidification of the worldwide empire under the Illuminati banner. And part of that solidification was to remove the Jews from Britain. In 1882, the young Prince George, who would be king, joined his brothers in a tour around the world, and he kept a diary where he traveled, including the Holy Land. He traveled with his older brother, the Prince of Wales, Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence. The Holy Land, its children of the land of Israel, will come here from all over the world, and a new Jewish nation will be resurrected in the Holy Land, is what King George V, as a young prince, in his diary, during his visit in Jerusalem in the spring of 1882. This quote from the diary of young King George V was published as part of Yakar Warzowski's article in the Yiddish newspaper Die Presse in April 23, 1948, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Although the author passed away in 1942, his article was published as an allusion to an event that was to take place in 3 weeks' time, the declaration of the State of Israel in May 14, 1948. Okay, but of course, by that time, the Zion in Salt Lake City, claiming to be another valid kingdom of God, was operating as well. And I'm not here to give an opinion about who's Jewish. I'm just here to talk about what happened. All right. Now, King George, when he was still prince, when he was the Duke of York, all right, his older brother Albert Victor was a member of the Masonic Order in London. And in the fall of 1888, Albert Victor and George were invited to go to Kaiser Wilhelm's new housewarming in Bath, Germany, for the initiation of George into the Order of the Bath. All right. And it was held over the solstice of 1888. And there were other people there. Alfred de Rothschild was there. Tsar Nicholas was there. And a young woman from Alfred de Rothschild's household was there. During the course of the initiation, and you know that these Illuminati initiations always have a sexual component, the Rothschild maid was impregnated by George. And as the initiation was over, George and Albert Victor went back to London, but within a couple months, the maid contacted George that she was pregnant and she wanted to come to London to confront him. In London, in the fall of 1888, when the maid was carrying George's child, there was a terror false flag event called Jack the Ripper. And Jack the Ripper terrorized the city of London for the fall of 1888 and kept out the maid from Germany who was carrying George's child. That child was born April the 29th, 1889, and was taken to the household of Alois Schicklgruber, who raised him as his own son. Schicklgruber himself was illegitimate offspring of the Rothschild family. So that this young boy was brought up close to the Rothschilds in Germany, and he was mentored by his father's cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm, until 1912, when he traveled to London with his sister, and he lived in London for a while and got in contact with his father. All right. King George V, in 1917, changed his German name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, a more British-sounding name. The same year, that he allowed and encouraged the Zionists to move their kingdom back to the Mideast. And his eldest illegitimate son, being German, was furious, absolutely furious, and the father and son at that point parted ways. The son was beside himself with fury and remorse over what his father, the king, had done, because the son didn't have a high regard for Judaism or for Zionism. And so when the king was failing, this son went back to the palace to see his father one last time, and he took out a gun and blew away his father's face, so that King George V had to have a closed bier. He could not have the ordinary state funeral lying in state of a king. Why else, if George V had been merely ailing, was he not able to be viewed by the public in an open bier, as is the custom for kings? And the name of that eldest illegitimate son, who was infuriated by the Zionist movement of the kingdom back to Palestine, okay, the name of that son was Adolf Hitler, who fled unnoticed because he was known by palace staff, a son who had been written out of England's future because of George's alliance with the Rothschild family, who were rich Illuminati Zionists. Okay. Now, the way this becomes obvious that something really strange happened, and it's discussed in Wiki as, you know, oh, did George, was he just put out of his misery? At King George's funeral, it was a very, very strange situation. There were two armies present at his funeral. The German army was at his feet and the British army at his side, but the family were not present. And the situation created such terror in George's eldest presumed heir, Edward VIII, the Prince of Wales at the time. He fled from Britain from the fear that he would be accused of the murder of his father. He fled to America, and he was represented from that day on by lookalikes, doppelgangers, and his old girlfriend, Wallace Warfield Simpson. A whole story was told about his presumed abdication for the love of a woman, and Wallace Warfield Simpson acted out a life of being the Duchess of Windsor for the balance of her life. She was the one who went to the Bahamas with a doppelganger and then went on to Paris. And so Edward died in obscurity, as had Prince John, who was disappeared into America, and Edward's old uncle, presumed heir and Prince of Wales, Albert Victor, who had been detained at Glamis Castle until his death in 1931. And the practice of disappearing members of the British royal family who didn't fit in to the doctrine of the day, which was to promote Rothschild Zionism, has resulted in Edward's children. Edward had 4 children, were all, the eldest, Pierre Edouard, was born in Paris in 1918, and Edward supported him. The second one, Elizabeth, born to Wallace Warfield Simpson in 1934, was disappeared into Tennessee. And her website, called we3.org, is still online, and you can see her pictures. In 1936, Edward married Claudia Ruth O'Keefe, the sister of the American artist Georgia O'Keeffe from Madison, Wisconsin. And they lived in obscurity in the United States. All right. In 1939, Claudia gave birth to the first daughter, Margaret, who was with them for 2 years before the kidnapping and taking her and dumping her in a family, I believe, in Alabama. And the younger daughter, also Elizabeth, like Wallace Warfield Simpson's daughter, was born in 1944 and at the age of 6 weeks, kidnapped and dumped into the adoption and child trafficking market in San Francisco. And I was that younger daughter. All right. But let's now return to the situation with Nazi Germany and the Illuminati. You see, the Illuminati and the fascists have some overlap, but they're quite different. And that's because Adolf Hitler in Germany, being somewhat of an intuitive and telepath, had friends who got him in contact with the Anunnaki, who originally settled this world 450,000 years ago. And Hitler's women who were writing down what the Anunnaki told them were able to write down the plans to back engineer saucer craft and get deep into the advanced technology of the Anunnaki that the ETs wanted to introduce to humanity in order to fight space wars. All right. So come the end of World War II and Operation Paperclip, the German Nazis came to the United States. Some of them came to the United States, and a lot more went down to Antarctica, Operation High Jump, okay? And in 1958, there was a worldwide treaty, the Antarctica Treaty, to keep everybody away from Antarctica because there were strange things going on in Antarctica. All right. So, 1947, the UFOs began showing up significantly in the press and in reports, and people were seeing them and writing about them and talking about them. So that in 1954, Eisenhower was pretty much pressured into meeting with the tall whites and the Anunnaki and the Greys to come to some kind of meeting of the minds with them. According to the testimonies examined so far, the February 20th, 21st, 1954 meeting was not successful, and the extraterrestrials were spurned due to their refusal to enter into technology exchanges and their insistence on nuclear disarmament by the U.S. and presumably by other major world powers. Later in 1954, the race of large-nosed gray aliens which had been orbiting the Earth landed at Holloman Air Force Base. A basic agreement was reached. This race identified themselves as originating from a planet around a red star in the constellation of Orion, which is called Betelgeuse. They stated that their planet was dying and that at some unknown future time, they would no longer be able to survive there. The meeting at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, has reportedly been the site of subsequent extraterrestrial meetings with the same extraterrestrials who, it will be shown, signed the 1954 treaty in 1972 and 73. The producers Robert Emmenegger and Alan Sandler had allegedly been offered and witnessed actual Air Force film footage of a meeting involving gray extraterrestrials that occurred at Holloman Air Force Base in 1971. Cooper explained the terms of the 1954 treaty reached with the gray extraterrestrials as follows. So the U.S. government signed a treaty with ETs. The treaty stated that the aliens would not interfere in our affairs and we would not interfere in theirs. We would keep their presence on Earth a secret. They would furnish us with advanced technology and would help us in our technological development. They would not make any treaty with any other Earth nation. They would abduct humans on a limited and periodic basis for the purpose of medical examination and monitoring of our development, with the stipulation that the humans would not be harmed, would be returned to their point of abduction, would have no memory of the event, and that the alien nation would furnish Majesty 12 with a list of all human contacts and abductees on a regular scheduled basis. Now, I personally was abducted in 1953 in the summer, and I was not harmed, but I was scared out of my wits. And it took many, 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 many years for me to remember the experience. And the reason I remembered is that a couple of implants popped out of me and I realized what they were. Okay, link number 9, the TAUIX Treaty of 2005 during the Bush Jr. administration. On March 15th, where did it go? 2003, according to Dr. Dan Burish, the TAUIX Treaty with aliens was renegotiated but would not go into effect until 2005. The recently signed TAUIX Treaty and the forgiving presence of celestial entities opened the path to bring projects into fruition without rushing into the ark, namely the underground. We know that alien abductions take place, or did until recently. From many sources, we have learned that these were supposedly done under the auspices of a treaty, possibly the TAUIX Treaty referred to in this thread recently, allegedly signed by an agency of our government, MJ-12. Okay, I'm just reading from the report. We know from above Blackbee, Sergeant Dan Sherman, that coordinates were given, at least on occasion, to our government regarding specific abductions per treaty conditions. We hear from Zeta Talk that these dutiful notifications began to be abused by one group of aliens that would give misleading coordinates or even none at all, leading the other group to also forego these treaty conditions. Thus, we learned that there are two groups of these aliens. Though Dr. Burish says that they are from our future, they were still classified as extraterrestrial. Because the British had followed the Illuminati line and let the Zionist line go back to Palestine and Israel, Britain essentially threw its relationship with the Anunnaki away that they might have had if King George V had been paying better attention. The Illuminati, being obsessed with Zionism, retreated into cultural nationalism and globalism. Only Hitler's fascist party and Operation Paperclip took the challenge of the Anunnaki and recent treaties, including the 58 Antarctica treaties, seriously, and they removed themselves to Antarctica, where they are to this day. All right, so those are the treaties. That's the sequence of treaties that we in the West have come to be subject to. And instead of our parliament and our Congress, okay, operating from the common laws of the original Mosaic covenant, the original holy laws of God, the original behaviors that create peace and prosperity in a society, since 1588, maritime admiralty, corporate statutes, uniform commercial codes, which deem that humans are merely consumable products, okay, being birthed at the dock, okay, all right, humanity is not being treated very well by its own leadership, all right. One of the things that I discovered in the Holy Law was that in Israel there was a practice of they did have prostitutes, okay, but it's from the Babylonian revisions to the law that certain other sexual practices have entered into the worldwide culture in the name of Zionism and Islam and globalism. And those are human trafficking, human experimentation, body parts marketing, drug running, and serial wars for profit. None of these practices of empire are in our holy laws that were given by Moses for the nation of Israel to thrive, all right? None of those practices are contained in the Christian covenant at all, but they have permeated our society because empires have always considered sex work to be an economic, just business, it's just business. Prostitution's just business. Having sex with children is just business. Experimenting on undesirable people or culling on it's just business, all right? So what has happened in our day is that the holy laws of God, which are given to us in the Pentateuch, are being all but ignored in favor of business that's more profitable, okay, in terms of usury and porn and prostitution and medical experimentation. And so that's, I started with the idea we are what we owe. And what we owe is respect and reverence and decency and law-abiding behavior if we are here on this world and we want to be a credit to God who gave us life. And we have a problem that the legal system does not abide with the laws of God. So what do we do? What do we do? Can we just fire all the judges and fire all the attorneys and lawyers, kick them all out and start over? What some of us on YouTube have discovered in the last couple of years is that there's just been a lot more mischief than even that, because we're not being told truth about a lot of things, in addition to not being told truth about what law actually is supposed to constitute. What archaeologists and researchers now are finding, who are going over old maps and old etchings and old drawings and old daguerreotypes, is that there have been several resets, which in the Christian idiom is called an Armageddon. There have been several. There wasn't just the flood of Noah's day and Sodom and Gomorrah and the walls of Jericho There have been cities that are now underwater. There are cities that are now under mud. The 1847 mud flood was worldwide because it was at the same depth and level in St. Petersburg, Russia, as in New York City, as in London, as in St. Louis, Missouri. The mud flood has become a topic of study for researchers to show that this fear of an Armageddon keeps getting returned back and back and back. So we have been subject to the commerce of the empire and its porn and prostitution and human experimentation and its vices over and over and over again. Babylon had those practices. Assyria, Greece, Rome, Tartary, all practice the worship of Baal and Moloch and the sacrifice of the innocent, the sacrifice of unwanted children and troublesome elders and dissidents. Those empire practices have followed humanity from Babylon onward to today. And so the only idea that comes to me that would make any sense at all is that we need to go back and look at all of our holy books and look at the communities that are able to keep the peace where they are. Okay, there are churches and spiritual orientations that do not teach revenge, that do not teach racial culling, that do not teach specialness, that do not teach the behaviors that create war and misery in the world. And I know some Sikhs who are like that, and the Jains are like that, and the Mennonites, and the Amish, and the Hutterites, and the Essenes. The Essenes are a Jewish sect. They are very peaceable, all right? And so we need to go back to our philosophy and our holy books and look them over and decide which of the holy books really represents the God of peace and the God of harmony and the God of live and let live in our world. We are now living in the age of Aquarius, which is supposed to be, it says here somewhere in fine print, it's supposed to be an age of peace. And in order to get to an age of peace, we are going to have to do some work. We're going to have to do some real soul searching and decide what kind of world we want to live in. Do we want to live in a world where ideologies are simply allowed, okay, to practice the same old imperial empire vices going back hundreds and thousands of years, okay, culling and using cruelty to get rid of people, when in fact, when you get rid of people, when you execute people, you're really putting off the problem, because whoever did a capital crime, as soon as you execute him, his soul is free and he doesn't have to pay any reparations and he doesn't have to deal with the problem anymore, all right? So executing people who are undesirable is probably the least effective thing you can do to make circumstances improve, all right? So we need to rethink that whole ideology of revenge and execution of criminals, and we need to think about problem solving in terms of problem solving, mediation, arbitration, conciliation. Wishing that problems will manifest solutions just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, all right? So this is where I come to in my episode called We Are What We Owe, because what we owe is accountability for our behavior. What we think is just what we know at the moment, what we believe at the moment. What we think is just what's clanking around in the head bone. But what makes us world worthy and ascension worthy and salvation worthy is our behavior that values other people and willing to go the distance to make law work. I would like to suggest that the Uniform Commercial Code and corporate statutes and the Maritime Admiralty statutes must all be made subject to the common laws that God gave to Moses. All of them, not just the first 10, which are attitude adjustments, but the behavioral laws that God gave to Moses are the best. They're just the best. And so this has been Emily Windsor Craig, and now you know a little bit more about my story. And yes, I'm kind of an odd soul. And this is what I do, is talk about how do we get to peace from here. I think we're going to have to work for it. It's not going to come easy. It's not going to come easy. I want to thank you for any of you who sat through this whole thing, all right? I'm not a polished speaker. I'm just speaking from my heart. Okay, I have books at Amazon. I'll put a couple of the titles down below. I try to clarify history and explain from the Sumerian cuneiform tablets how the story in Genesis is true. The Genesis story is a marvelous summary of what happened over a long period of time. And so I do not criticize the scriptures for being off or wrong or anything. They're the best version we have of the plot in the Bible, which is to say, Genesis 3:15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He will bruise you in the head and you will bruise him in the heel, right? The plot of the Bible is to get rid of the seed of the serpent, and the seed of the serpent is the empire, the cynical, hedonistic, nihilistic empire in which human beings are nothing but consumable objects. That's the whole purpose of following these studies and sharing them with people. So you'll see me on YouTube and on Facebook and on Twitter, and this is how I spend my retirement. It's important to me that we should achieve peace in our time. Thank you very much for coming by. Bye-bye.